Thank you very much, Major General, for highlighting these crucial aspects. And I would like to invite Professor Swaran Singh for his remarks, and would also like to, apart from his prepared remarks, if so, because India is a signatory to the United Nations and a firm advocate of world peace. Since you have been my teacher in JNU and you have taught me peace and conflict resolution, so I would like you to throw some light on the budget and peace and conflict resolution. What are the prospects? Are we really ready for peace by allocating 6.22 lakh crore in the defense sector? Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Simi. It's a delight. I've been listening to all the speakers so far. Excellent remarks, one after another. And I'm happy you put a certain preface to where India wants to be. A budget, in that sense, is largely a expression of intent. Budget showcases the vision where leadership of the country wants to take that country. I think in that sense, budget has to be viewed way beyond the figures that it gives. It also sends far more other interesting underlying messages. One simple message that we should keep in mind is that budget outlays always have budget estimates in the end. So invariably, it should be our caution to compare this year's budget outlays with last year's budget outlays and not with last year's budget estimates. In most of the heads, budget estimates increase. Some of them increase substantially. Very rarely, I think very rarely, some heads, the budget estimates will be lower than budget outlays. So that's point number one. Budget that is now being given to us. In most sectors, this will increase before the year comes to, before the financial year comes to end. Second, it's a cohesive collective budget. It's the union budget of Government of India. And even when you have separate heads, separate ministries, separate allocations made, their work is always complementary, sometimes overlaps. So, for instance, when we are talking about nearly 22,000 crores budget of Ministry of External Affairs, that's only for the Ministry of External Affairs. But it's not only Ministry of External Affairs that runs foreign policy. Prime Minister's office runs foreign policy. National Security Advisor runs foreign policy. Your Commerce Ministry runs foreign policy. Your Sports Ministry runs foreign policy. Your think tanks run foreign policy. Your universities run foreign policy. Your city administration run foreign policy too. So, job of Ministry of External Affairs is to create a broad bandwidth within which the vision of India's foreign policy has to be explained and explicated for other stakeholders. So 22,000 crores is not the only money that is going into how foreign policy will be enacted or how effective the foreign policy will be. Then, of course, one should also be careful. Often when we are talking of major powers, we are talking in terms of dollars. But then there is also something called purchasing power parity. What rupee can buy in India is going to be very different if you simply look at it in terms of dollars. Now, of course, to some extent, foreign procurements will be in dollars, but that is also a nuance as to rupees can buy much more. And in each nation, the level of agility, the level of training, the level of commitment of the personnel, including in armed forces and in Ministry of External Affairs, is also going to be at variance. Linguistic skills of people in Ministry of External Affairs are going to be very different. India being an English-speaking country adds to foreign policy or diplomacy in major ways. So again, figures are only indicator of where we want to go, but they do not necessarily define our leverages as to what exactly we will be able to achieve. And then, of course, as you know, our leaders have said repeatedly, there are a lot of intangibles. How your foreign minister behaves, articulates, how your prime minister engages with the world, uh, and whole lot of other credentials of India being a democracy, India being largest population country, etc., etc. There are so many intangibles that also beef up India's efforts and efficacy as to where this budget will take us. So that's a preface to what I'm going to speak as to why budget figures should be taken with a lot of caution and primarily should be seen in terms of intent, whereas the leverages that the budget will create, the efficacy and outcomes that will flow from here are going to be far away, far different in different cases of countries, including India. So let's keep in mind those other variables, those other intangibles, where India again is seen as a major uh, flag bearer of peace, as Sydney wanted me to underline, and of course a country that have stood by principles, normative foreign policy, etc. Now, let's talk about the brass tacks. Uh, India's budget was presented, and what it wants to do was clearly outlined by a very articulate foreign minister in his ex-comment, saying that the priority of Ministry of External Affairs is going to be in that hierarchical order: neighborhood, Act East, Global South, and Indians traveling abroad. I think we have known that neighborhood, a great detail of discussion has already taken place about figures that are being assigned to connect with the neighborhood, etc. Look East is another celebrated part of India's foreign policy. India is trying lately to engage with Global South. I think two Global South summit meetings last year and African Union coming into G20 was a major, uh, kind of a major achievement of India in that sense. I think this adding on Indians traveling abroad is a very interesting component of where the money is going to be spent. One can think of 1992 Gulf War I. India brought back Indian citizens from Middle East, but that was in a major crisis of economy. All of you remember how Sushma Swaraj started a whole new campaign where individual Indian citizens, not en masse Indians in crisis, but individual Indian citizens in distress around the world became concern of Ministry of External Affairs. And that, I think, is a very significant expression of intent to bring a certain pride among Indians who are living around the world. And that is in continuation of that mindset that we have seen that when Prime Minister went to Moscow, he took up issues of Indians in the Russian armed forces who needed to be brought back, brought out of that difficult scenario. Recently, Foreign Minister was in Vientiane. Discussions happened with Thailand, with Laos, about 100 plus Indians who scammed into cyber scams of certain kind. They need to, so there are very specific focus on Indian citizens. So some of that budget, other than neighborhood, is going to go into taking care of Indian citizens. I think that's a very good development in where the MEA wants to use its money. Now, third, a very significant point, which also was discussed repeatedly, how India wants to emerge as a aid provider country. We are called lately for about 10 years now net security provider in the region. We are also now being noticed as a country that is providing aid. Mention of lines of credit was made. That has also become much more effective tool lately. I think we have over $30 billion of lines of credit in various countries. Then, of course, MEA is outlining about $2.2 billion of aid. So put together about $32 billion of aid in the system. Now, if India has to be Viksit Bharat, India has to be world power and, one among the three top nations, at least in terms of economic power, this is still peanuts compared to where major powers that are influencing global narratives. Agenda setting and narrative setting is a very important part of whether you want to build peace and stability or you want to build partners for prosperity. United States, for example, has a total total assistance, aid and assistance, which goes beyond $1 trillion. And I just mentioned $32 billion of India. In fact, there are about 8, 9 other countries, all small countries of Nordic countries, all of them more than $500 billion of foreign. And so MEA has to focus that if MEA wants to push India into one of the great powers of 21st century, then that aid and assistance driven partnerships will have to be as much part and parcel as we want to build our technology transfers related or co-production related partnership with other countries. So I think that is very significant. Now, let me move very clearly, quickly to Ministry of Defense, which is, I think, another very interesting discussion has taken place so far. We have heard a whole lot of commentaries on this. Again, defense budget, same thing applies. Does not tell whole story of what can be achieved. But let me first flag a couple of things that I notice to me are seen as areas flagged in terms of intent where Government of India wants to go. Very clearly, the most important area that one notices is the focus on Atmanirbhar Bharat. We have seen over the last 2, 3, 4 years about 800 items have been earmarked that will not be procured from abroad, will be produced locally. So we noticed that the different reports are talking of 61% to 70% of the procurement budget is meant for procurements from within the country. Of course, you want to make that local production far more competitive. And I like the way General Chaudhary mentioned you should openly also promote exports, which is also being done interestingly, because last year you would remember Prime Minister had given a target of $1.5 billion for India's defense exports. So India's defense exports definitely are becoming a priority. How successful we are compared to United States exporting about 25% of the global exports of defense equipment. India will take time. It takes time for credibility to be built in other countries. It takes time to fine-tune processes, etc. But along with self-reliance, which is a major focus of this government and this budget, I think exports has also been a major focus of this budget. Second, I heard General Chakravarti mention about defense pension. Bulk of your budget here, 6.2 lakh crore and 1.4 lakh crore is meant for defense budgets, which does not add to the punch of Indian Armed Forces. Sorry to say. But I also remember that I think from early 91, 92, defense pensions actually were separated once upon a time from defense budget. I think at some stage later they were brought back into the defense budget. But I agree that defense pensions should be part of the other Ministry of Personnel, for example, should look at that part of the budget. And defense budget, which normally gives an impression of the punch of the country in terms of dealing with adversaries, should not have pensions in it. But thanks to pensions, the reverse argument I'm making also is interesting. Thanks to pensions, that India's defense budget looks about $75 billion. If you remove pensions, then this budget really looks really tiny, and that also has impression on perception management, how the world, how adversaries look at how much money is being allocated to defense budget, is also interesting. In fact, if you look at now the top 10 defense spenders in the country, even when defense pensions are part of defense budget, India is very likely this year to become 5th largest. We were till recently 3rd largest defense spender country after the United States and China. Because of Ukraine war, Russia is now, of course, the 3rd largest. Saudi Arabia is just, is about to scrape ahead of India if it continues to put money into its defense imports, etc. So that also has perception in terms of India's punch as to whether India is seen as 3rd largest defense spender as we were till recently, or we are seen as the 5th largest defense spender while being world's largest population country. I mean, defense budget is supposed to protect these manpower, these citizens of India. And if we have largest population of the country and we have the 5th largest budget for defense, now this kind of creates a certain perception. I think that has to be looked upon. India has also this time focused much more the focus of this budget on veteran care. I think this ruling party has seen veterans as a very important constituency of ex-servicemen, for example, and about 48% increase in the budget for what is called ex-servicemen contributory health scheme, which I think is important because India is now will have much more aging population, and people who retired from armed forces are usually healthier, fitter, and more nationally dedicated, and integrity, etc., is better. So India has to focus on our elder citizens, growing senior citizens, because that number is going to increase. I sometimes say that a generation that faced India's opening up and reforms from 1990s and went out to make much more money than their earlier generations had made. That generation is now retiring with good health, good money, with a lot of skill sets, and that population has to be catered. And I think that clearly this part of the budget, with 48% increase, is looking at taking care of veterans of Indian Armed Forces. Focus on frontier infrastructure. I think this whole tension with China has brought that also into enormous focus. So defense budget has now about 30% increase this year for border roads organization, so that we can create better infrastructure. And I always say better infrastructure in frontier areas, of course, helps mobility of armed forces. It also makes life of people in those frontier areas also easier, who we otherwise call them remote areas. They are not remote areas, they are frontier areas. And we need to take care of those, particularly when China is building about 700 villages on the frontier areas. I think that again is a very interesting priority that we notice is happening. And final point, I think that number one issue that is highlighted about what this budget wants to do across all sectors is the mention of job creation. Job creation through skill development, through education, through innovation, increase in productivity, etc. And from that perspective, you notice the 22,000 crore budget of MEA is meant for about 5,000 people, of which about nearly 1,000 IFS officers. But Indian armed forces are about 1.4 million people. So that equation also have to be understood as to how many people are going to be utilizing that budget. And my last point, and I think I'm almost dragging this forcefully because I come from academia, compared to MEA's budget of 22 crores for, as I said, 5,000 people. Then, of course, MOD budget of 6.2 lakh crore for 1.4 million people. Budget on education is about 1.4 lakh crore. And how much education sector employs? 10 times compared to armed forces. And I'm only talking of teachers. I'm not talking of staff. I'm not talking of students. I'm not talking of other auxiliary people who draw money out of education sector. So when India, as the largest democracy, wants to allocate resources, it has to be extremely careful in dividing the pie. And in that sense, education sector also helps both in foreign policy and in defense. And mention was made in the beginning of peace research, peace education. And I think there is a need for us to make sure that India has to grow holistically. And depending on where the lobbies are stronger, we have seen budgets sometimes being impacted in terms of allocations from that perspective. I suppose budgets in the future gradually will become far more balanced and therefore produce a holistic, comprehensive national strength as our leverage to ensure both our security and our prosperity. I'll stop at that and I look forward if there are any comments or questions. Thank you very much and back to you.
Thank you so much, sir.